In 1860, a St. Louis soap maker took over a bankrupt brewery to settle a debt. It made about 3,200 barrels a year and could not sell them. 148 years later, that same brewery sold for $52 billion, and the family who built it did not sell it. They watched it go, holding 4% of a company with their name on the building. Here is how that happened. The debt. The brewery started with a man named George Schneider, who opened it in South St. Louis in 1852 and called it the Bavarian Brewery. He did not last. Neither did the men who bought it from him. By 1859, it was run by two partners who had borrowed heavily to expand the plant, pushed output up toward 3,200 barrels, and then discovered the obvious problem with expanding a brewery, which is that building more capacity does not create more drinkers. They went under. One of the creditors was Eberhard Anheuser, born in 1806 in Bad Kreuznach in Germany, and by then a successful St. Louis manufacturer of soap and candles. He knew nothing about beer. What he knew was that he was owed money by a business with no cash, and that the only way to get anything back was to take the thing itself. So in 1860, with a business associate named William D. Onch, he bought out the smaller creditors and became, without any particular enthusiasm, a brewer. What he had acquired was a failed plant in a crowded city, making a product that spoiled in days. Beer could not travel, and it had to be drunk within a few miles of where it was made, and St. Louis already had something like 3 dozen breweries in it. The man who solved all of that was already in town, selling supplies to the competition. Adolphus Busch was born on the 10th of July, 1839, near Mainz, one of a very large number of children, more than 20 by most counts, born to a prosperous Rhineland merchant. He came to the United States in 1857 at 18, with money enough to matter but not enough to coast. He served briefly in the Union Army, and he went into business selling brewing supplies to St. Louis brewers, which meant that within a few years he knew every brewery in the city, what each one was doing wrong, and exactly how much money each one was making. One of his customers was Eberhard Anheuser. On the 7th of March, 1861, Adolphus Busch married Anheuser's daughter, Lily, who was 17. It was a double wedding. His brother Ulrich married her sister Anna the same day. 2 brothers, 2 sisters, one afternoon. Whatever else that was, it was also a transaction, and it worked exactly as a transaction should. Busch went into the brewery. He bought in, then bought more, and when the shares were finally counted, there were 480 of them, and Busch held 238, and Anheuser and Lilly split 240 between them, and the brewmaster had the last 2. Hold on to that share count, because who owns how much of this company is the whole story, and it never stops moving. Subscribe and follow it all the way down. Eberhard Anheuser died in 1880. He left company stock and, in cash, $7,426. He also left his son William, with whom he had quarreled, exactly $1. By then, the name on the building had already changed. In 1879, it became the Anheuser Busch Brewing Association, and the order of those 2 names tells you who was running it. The soap maker's debt had become a son-in-law's company. The son-in-law was about to do something nobody in American brewing had managed. 1,000 miles cold. Every brewer in America in 1870 faced the same wall. Beer went bad. Lager, in particular, had to be fermented cold and stored cold, and once it left the cellar, it had a matter of days before it turned. That meant every brewery was a local business by physical law. You sold to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was your ceiling. Adolphus Busch spent the 1870s dismantling that wall, piece by piece, with other people's ideas. He took Louis Pasteur's work on heating liquids to kill what spoils them and applied it to bottled beer, making Anheuser Busch among the first American brewers to pasteurize at scale. Now the beer survived the trip. Then he built the trip. Refrigerated rail cars from around 1876, eventually numbering in the hundreds, and along the routes a chain of ice houses so the cars could be recharged as they went. Beer left St. Louis cold. It stayed cold for 1,000 miles. It arrived cold. There is a story, and it has the shape of a story, so treat it as one, that he shipped a bottle to Europe and back, and dared anyone to taste the difference. None of that was invention. All of it was assembly. Busch's actual genius was seeing that a local product plus a national logistics system equals a national product, and being willing to spend enormous amounts of money on the second half of that equation, while his competitors spent theirs on brewing. In 1876, he needed something to put in the cars. He had a friend in St. Louis, a wine and liquor importer named Carl Conrad, and between them, they produced a light Bohemian-style lager, brewed for Conrad by Anheuser Busch and sold under a name taken from the Bohemian town of Budweiser. Conrad registered the trademark in 1878. He went bankrupt in 1883, and the brand passed entirely to the brewery that had been making it all along. That is how the Busch family came to own Budweiser. They did not invent it, and they did not name it. They brewed it for somebody else, and then that somebody else failed. Michelob followed in 1896, sold as the connoisseur's draft. And the numbers moved the way numbers move when a business has solved a problem nobody else has solved. In 1865, the brewery made about 8,000 barrels. By the year Eberhard Anheuser died, it was making 141,163. By 1901, it was over 1 million a year. From 3,200 barrels to 1 million inside one working life. Adolphus Busch died on the 10th of October, 1913, at his estate in Germany. His body was brought home to St. Louis, and something close to 30,000 people filed past the casket in the family mansion beside the brewery. It took 25 truckloads to carry the flowers. A 250-piece band led the procession to the cemetery, and by the estimates of the day, 100,000 people stood along the route to watch it pass. His estate was assessed at roughly $60 million, reportedly among the largest ever probated in Missouri. He left his son a company at the absolute top of American brewing, 6 years before the United States made its product illegal. 13 dry years. August Anheuser Busch Sr. took over in 1913. Within 4 years, the country was at war with the nation his family came from, and the Busch fortune was briefly seized under the Alien Property Act, released only after Lily Busch established that she was a loyal American. Then, on the 17th of January 1920, the manufacture and sale of alcohol became illegal across the United States. For a company whose entire physical infrastructure existed to make and move one product, this should have been the end. For most of their competitors, it was. The American brewing industry did not shrink during Prohibition. It largely ceased to exist. The going value of the Anheuser Busch plant as scrap was reportedly around $30 million. And the same decision was to take it. They did not take it. What they did instead was refuse to be a brewery for 13 years. The company sold baker's yeast and became very good at it. They sold malt syrup, which was legally an ingredient for baking and was, in overwhelming practice, what people used to brew beer at home, a fact the company was not obliged to investigate. They made soft drinks. They made ice cream. They built truck bodies and refrigeration units because a company that had spent 40 years mastering refrigerated transport had an unusual amount of expertise sitting idle. Those 13 years left a mark on how the family thought, and the mark lasted a century. Anheuser Busch had survived by refusing to be only a beer company. Every later generation would reach for that same lesson, and each time it would take them further from the thing they were good at. Prohibition ended in December of 1933. To mark the first legal beer coming off the line, August Sr.'s sons gave him a gift, a hitch of Clydesdale horses, and that gift became one of the most durable pieces of advertising in American history, which nobody could have predicted on the day. Then, in February of 1934, roughly 2 months after the company he had saved was allowed to sell beer again, August Anheuser Busch Sr. shot himself at Grant's farm. He was 68. He had been in serious decline for a long time, with heart disease, gout, and dropsy, and by contemporary accounts, he was in constant pain and had spoken of being unable to go on with it. He left a note for his family. A coroner's jury ruled it a suicide brought on by long illness. Accounts of the day differ slightly on the date and on the wound, and I would not press either detail harder than the record supports. The man who kept the company alive through the one event designed to kill it did not live to see it profitable again. His son Adolphus III took over and ran it for 12 years and died in 1946, which brought the chair to the second son. And the second son was unlike anyone else this family produced. The showman, August Anheuser Busch Jr., called Gussie by everyone, including people who had never met him, became the head of Anheuser Busch in 1946 and ran it the way a man runs something he intends to be seen running. The generations before him had been builders and survivors. Adolphus assembled a machine. August Sr. held it together through a national ban. Gussie did something neither of them had bothered with, which was to make the country feel something about the beer. In 1953, he had the company buy the St. Louis Cardinals. The team was struggling, and its previous owner had just been convicted of tax evasion. And Gussie bought it as an asset for a brewery, which is exactly what it was. Sportsman's Park became Busch Stadium. A beer company now owned a baseball team in the city where it brewed, in a country where baseball and beer were about to be married on television for the next 50 years. He put the Clydesdales everywhere. He built theme parks. He turned Grant's Farm, the family estate on ground once owned by Ulysses S. Grant, into something the public could walk through, with animals and a carriage ride and the horses in their stalls. He was photographed constantly, usually with the horses, often in a hat. His grandfather had solved distribution, which is a problem of trucks and rail and refrigeration. Gussie was solving something else entirely, which is the problem of why a person reaching into a cooler picks up one identical yellow lager instead of another identical yellow lager. There is no answer to that question inside the bottle. The answer is entirely outside it, in horses and stadiums and 30 seconds of television. And Gussie understood that before almost anyone in American business did. And the business worked. In 1957, Anheuser Busch became the largest brewer in the world, and it would not give that position up for half a century. By the standards of American consumer branding, what Gussie built in those years is close to the maximum available result. Budweiser stopped being a product people bought and became a thing people belonged to. The horses, the stadium, the king of beers, the sense that this particular beer was somehow the country itself in a can. That feeling is what the company was actually selling, and it is the thing that survives everything that comes next. Gussie married 4 times and had roughly 11 children. And the size of that family is not a piece of trivia. Every one of those children and their children would eventually hold a piece of a company that was slowly being cut into smaller and smaller shares. Then, in December of 1974, Gussie's 8-year-old daughter Christina was in a car crash. She died of her injuries on the 17th. The family chauffeur was killed as well. The man who came out of that was not the man who went into it. He was 75 years old, grieving, and reportedly ready to be finished with the whole enterprise, to the point of exploring whether the company should be sold. His son was watching. His son had been watching for a long time. The vote August Anheuser Busch III had been inside the company for years by then, and he was nothing like his father. Gussie sold romance. The third ran numbers. He was cold in meetings, obsessive about quality, and known for arriving at breweries before dawn to check whether the plant was clean. He also thought his father had stopped being fit to run the business. There was a specific trigger, and the accounts of it disagree on the order of events. By the version that comes from the standard history of the family, Gussie responded to being told to step aside by exploring a sale of the company outright to the tobacco giant R.J. Reynolds. By another account, he considered that only after he was already out, and it stayed secret for a decade. Either way, the son had reached the same conclusion. To him, this looked less like grief than like a man preparing to hand away the thing 5 generations had built. So in the spring of 1975, August III went to the board and had his father removed. It worked. The votes were there. The father was out. Gussie was pushed out of the chief executive role and given the title of honorary chairman, which is the corporate way of saying that a man may keep the office and lose the company. He held on to the Cardinals until he died in 1989, at 90, and he was buried having outlived his own removal by 14 years. This happens again later, in almost the same room. The son took the company from the father by vote. Not by inheritance, not by succession, not by the father stepping back, by a boardroom count against the founder's grandson in the family's own company. Look at who lost. Gussie had been the great popularizer, the man who made people feel something about a yellow lager, and the board removed him anyway because feelings are not a quarterly result. The instinct that saved the company in 1975 was the instinct to trust the operator over the showman. That instinct was correct for about 30 years, and it is the same instinct that eventually handed the decision to people who felt nothing about the company at all. And then the son who did it ran it better than anyone before him. Under August III, Anheuser Busch became a machine. He rolled Bud Light out across 40 states in March of 1982, and by 2001, it was the best-selling beer in America. He drove the company's share of American beer toward half of everything sold. He built distribution discipline that competitors could not match. By the 2000s, roughly 1 in every 2 beers an American drank came from his company. He was, by most measures, the most effective operator the family ever produced. What he could not control was the shareholder register, and that was quietly deciding everything else. 4%. The same fact goes missing from almost every telling. By the time the takeover came, the Busch family did not own Anheuser Busch, not in any meaningful sense. Not close. The arithmetic is simple, and nobody in the family seems to have watched it happen. A company that goes public sells pieces of itself. A family that keeps having children divides its remaining pieces among more people. Do both of those things for a century, and the ownership drains away without a single dramatic moment. One estate and one share issue at a time. Gussie alone reportedly controlled something like 12.5% of the stock, much of it locked in trusts that came apart when he died in 1989. Adolphus and Lily had 13 children. Gussie had around 11. By the 2000s, there were roughly 30 family members sharing the fortune, and their individual holdings had been cut and cut again. So when InBev came, the numbers on the page were these. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported that the company's executives and board members together held about 4.5% of all shares. Forbes put the founding family's own stake at roughly 4% and said plainly that this was not enough to control the direction of the company or to derail a takeover. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway held about 5%. A single investor in Omaha, who had bought the stock because he liked the business, owned a larger piece of Anheuser Busch than the entire family whose name was on the building, on the label, on the stadium, and on the horses. And here is the part that should have been fixed decades earlier and never was. Anheuser Busch had one class of common stock, one share, one vote for everybody. There was no family voting trust. There was no super voting share class of the kind the Ford family used to keep control of Ford through generations of dilution. There was no structure of any kind designed to hold this company in the family's hands when the family's money spread thin. 5 generations of Bushes built one of the great brands on earth and never built the one boring legal instrument that would have let them keep it. Ownership sounds abstract until the day it decides something. A public company belongs to whoever holds the shares, and every year the board must face those holders. If the family holds 4%, the family gets 4% of the vote, and the other 96% is held by pension funds and index funds and investors who have never seen the brewery and owe it nothing. When someone offers those holders a large cash premium, they take it, because taking it is their job. The buyers had built exactly that. The Brazilian financiers behind InBev ran their businesses on concentrated founder control. They were about to demonstrate the difference. 8 weeks in summer. On the 11th of June, 2008, InBev made an offer for Anheuser Busch. $65 a share, all cash, roughly $46 billion. InBev was itself a recent invention. A 2004 merger of a Belgian brewer and a Brazilian one, run by a Brazilian chief executive named Carlos Brito, and backed by financiers whose entire method was buying large, sleepy companies and cutting costs out of them with a knife. The chief executive of Anheuser Busch was August Busch IV. He had been in the job for about 18 months. That April, with the rumors already circulating, he had told the company's beer distributors that Anheuser Busch would not be bought while he was running it. On the 26th of June, the board rejected the offer as financially inadequate, which was the beginning of the fight, not the end of it. What followed was 8 weeks of pressure applied with total professional calm. InBev prepared a slate of directors to replace the entire Anheuser Busch board and take the question directly to shareholders, which is the corporate equivalent of announcing that if the door stays shut, you will simply buy the house. Anheuser Busch looked at defenses. The most serious one was buying the half of the Mexican brewer Grupo Modelo it did not already own, making itself too large and too expensive to swallow. InBev warned publicly that a move like that could put its generous price at risk. Meanwhile, the city reacted the way a city does when its largest and oldest name is in play. There were petitions. There were state politicians proposing ways to slow a foreign acquisition. There were people in St. Louis who genuinely believed the beer was theirs, in some way that a share register does not recognize. And the shareholders, that 4.5% aside, were not conflicted. The stock had closed at $49.20 at the end of April. In the entire history of the company, it had never traded above $51.97. They were being offered $70. Sentiment about horses and stadiums did not enter into it. On the 13th of July, The board met with its bankers and its lawyers. InBev raised the offer to $70 a share, about $52 billion in total. Both boards approved it. The vote was unanimous. Nobody dissented. Not one director. The worst of it happened inside the family. August Busch III, the man who had taken the company from his own father to keep it out of R.J. Reynolds' hands, is reported to have supported selling it to InBev. His half-brother Adolphus IV is reported to have backed the sale as well. And by some accounts, he had been carrying a grudge about the 1975 coup for more than 30 years. At one stage, InBev signaled that the new board would have no place for August IV, but would have a place for his uncle Adolphus, who was in favor. When the price went to 70, the fourth got his seat back. Those accounts come from journalism and from family sources rather than from any document, and I would not state them harder than that. But the outcome is not in dispute. The last Bush running the company opposed losing it, and the Bushes around him did not save him. On the 12th of November 2008, shareholders approved the merger. On the 18th, it closed. Anheuser Busch InBev, headquartered in Leuven, Belgium. 148 years after a soap maker took a failed brewery to settle a debt, it was over in 8 weeks. What the name is worth. The cutting started almost immediately on the 8th of December 2008, 3 weeks after closing. The new owners announced 1,400 American job cuts, about 3/4 of them in St. Louis, on top of more than 1,000 buyouts already taken. Over the following years, the St. Louis workforce fell from around 6,000 to about 4,000. Theme parks were sold, costs came out with the knife the buyers were known for. August Busch IV left with a great deal of money. Reports put his total from the sale near $100 million, along with a consulting arrangement worth about $120,000 a month running for years, and a seat on the new company's board. The brewery workers who stayed did not have a comparable arrangement. Their own moment came much later, in 2024, when 5,000 Teamsters voted by 86% to ratify a contract raising wages by $8 an hour over 5 years, after coming close to a strike. The family cashed out over a weekend. The men who make the beer negotiated their raise 15 years afterward. As for the fourth, his life had already been marked twice by the deaths of women, and both incidents are matters of official record rather than speculation. In November of 1983, a 22-year-old woman named Michelle Frederick died in the crash of a car he was driving in Arizona. After a lengthy investigation, prosecutors declined to file charges, citing insufficient evidence. In December of 2010, a 27-year-old woman named Adrienne Martin died at his home in Missouri. The medical examiner ruled the death an accidental overdose of oxycodone. The prosecutor filed no charges. A civil suit brought by her family was later settled for about $1.75 million, a settlement that carries no finding of liability. 2 women died. No charges were ever brought in either case. That is where the record stops, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Meanwhile, the brand went on being the most American thing in any cooler in the country. The Clydesdales still run in the commercials. It is still called the King of Beers, although Bud Light, which held the top spot in America for about 20 years, was passed by a Mexican lager in 2023. And across much of Europe, Anheuser Busch InBev cannot legally sell it under the name Budweiser at all, because a Czech state brewer in the town the beer was named after has been fighting them over that word since 1907, and has won enough of those cases to keep it. In Germany and Austria, the American Budweiser is sold as Bud. In 2017, 5 of Gussie's descendants bought Grant's farm back for $51 million. That is the end of the timeline. It would be easy to make this a story about a family that got careless and lost a company, or a story about foreigners taking an American icon. Neither of those is what the record shows. Ownership is a thing you have to maintain, deliberately, with paperwork, across generations. And this family maintained the brand with enormous care and never once maintained the ownership. They protected the horses, they protected the recipe, they protected the slogan, the stadium, the image of the thing. Nobody protected the shares. What survived is remarkable. A name every American recognizes, a team of horses that means something to people who have never tasted the product. A word so valuable that 2 countries have been in court over it for more than a century. What did not survive is the family's ownership of any of it, and the last Bush in the chair, and the notion that a name on a building has anything at all to do with who owns the building. Which brings it back to a soap and candle maker in St. Louis in 1860, holding a bad debt and a bankrupt brewery that made about 3,200 barrels a year and could not sell them. He took it because he was owed money, and there was nothing else to take. Everything after that, the rail cars and the ice, the 13 dry years, the horses, the stadium, the half of a national market, the $52 billion, happened on top of that one reluctant decision. The debt got paid. The brewery is still running in St. Louis. The name is still on it, and has been since 1879, and it has not belonged to anyone named Bush since 2008. Tell me in the comments whose name you want on the next video. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.